Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We may have some more people filter in here. Let's see. When we get started, we're going to be getting started in 2 Maccabees chapter 5.
That in that book, I've only been through 3 books. I can't find it.
And by way of a little bit of review, 2 Maccabees isn't the continuation of 1 Maccabees, like we saw last time. 1 Maccabees sort of gave us this broad overview of the period of time from about 180 BC to about 60 BC. And the events that happened, sort of a broad scope, the political infighting and who was king and who assassinated that king and became king, and then who assassinated that king and became king. And the rebellion of the Jewish people to try to establish a separate state of Judea. So we saw sort of the big scale political history in 1 Maccabees. 2 Maccabees is going back through that same time period, but rather than giving us sort of the broad strokes of the political history, it's giving us sort of more detail, sort of choosing particular important events that happened during that same period and giving us more detail on them, telling the story with more detail and giving more examples. And so the first 4 chapters that we went through last time essentially set the stage, talked about the beginning of the Seleucid, the Syrian Greek kings over the region. We saw first a man named Onias, who was a pretty good high priest, and he ultimately got shuffled out when Antiochus Epiphanes, who we talked about before, who's about to do something really horrible in chapter 5. Antiochus Epiphanes, who we talked about before, became king. And remember, Epiphanes, the title he gave himself, means the manifestation of God. Right? It's the same word where we get the Feast of Epiphany, where in our belief God manifested himself in Christ's baptism. Antiochus thought he himself was the manifestation of the pagan Greek gods. So he, when he came to power, was bribed by a man named Jason, and that Jason was made the new high priest in Judea, which is right now still a province of that Greek-Syrian empire. Okay, we read already there's been some infighting, and almost immediately Jason, after being made the high priest, rather than trying to get the people to follow God's teachings, he immediately set out to try to Hellenize the population, building a gymnasium for them to exercise naked, setting up public games, trying to get them to renounce worshiping God and start worshiping the Greek gods, basically to try to curry more favor with the king, who's the one who made him the high priest in the first place. Okay, so that's pretty much where we left off last time in terms of the broad strokes of the characters who we're about to see again. Did anybody have any questions left over from before? Okay. So chapter 5, verse 1. Around this time, Antiochus set out for his second assault into Egypt. Okay, so remember, periodically, as we saw in 1 Maccabees, the Greek king in Alexandria, who's king of Egypt and Africa, and the Greek king in Syria, in this case Antiochus Epiphanes, who's in Antioch, fight over who's going to control what territory, both trying to expand into each other's territory. So this is the second time, just in Antiochus' rule, that he's tried to take some territory from Egypt. Verse 2, so it came about throughout the entire city of Jerusalem that for almost 40 days there were apparitions of horsemen dressed in apparel interwoven with gold, and moving quickly through the air, and companies fully armed with spears and drawn swords. Troops of horsemen set in battle array and making attacks and counterattacks on this side and on that, with the movement of shields and a multitude of spears, and the shooting of arrows and the brightness of gold ornaments and breastplates of all sorts. Therefore all the men prayed that the appearance might be for the good. So people start reporting having these weird visions while Antiochus is in Egypt of men on horseback, men fighting, of warfare. Okay, and so they pray that this is going to be a good thing somehow. This is a good omen. But as we're going to see, not so much. Verse 5, but when a false report was circulated that Antiochus was dead, Jason took no less than 1,000 men and suddenly made an assault upon the city. So remember, Jason is the high priest. Okay, so he hears a rumor that in this war going on that Antiochus has been killed, and so he decides to make a bid for independence. Right? So he decides, well, I will take over the city from the Greeks and make it my own. So apparently high priest's not good enough for him. He decides he wants to try and set himself up as king. When the men on the wall were driven off and the city was finally taken, Menelaus was banished into the citadel. And so the citadel, as we saw in 1 Maccabees, is that part of the city where the army was barracked. So this is Antiochus' Greek army, his barracks. So in this little revolution, Jason manages to force all of the Greek troops out of the city proper into this sort of fortress, this military barracks. Verse 6, but Jason kept slaughtering his own fellow citizens without mercy, not comprehending that success against his kinsmen was his very unlucky day, for he imagined that he was winning trophies over his enemies, rather than over people of the same race. So, apparently, the idea here is that it's not enough for Jason just to kind of take control, but he's also killing his enemies. Right? He's using this as an opportunity. The people who weren't going along with his Hellenization program, the people who had been opposing him in the past, he takes this as a great time to get some revenge. So he starts. So this isn't. We have to understand this isn't motivated by, Jason feeling for the suffering of his people, to the Greeks and wanting to set them free. Right? It has nothing to do. This is purely him wanting power and settling some scores while he's at it. Verse 7, yet he did not get the upper hand of the government, but in the end gained disgrace from his plot and took refuge again among the Ammonites. In the end, his life reached an ugly conclusion. He was accused before Aretas, the ruler of the Arabs, but fled from city to city. He was pursued by all, detested as a rebel against the laws, and abhorred as an executioner of his homeland and fellow citizens. Finally, he was cast ashore in Egypt. We noticed last time, you rarely have to guess what the writer of 2 Maccabees thinks of somebody. He gives you a pretty clear idea of his opinion. Thus he who so often banished many from their homelands himself perished in a strange land, for he had set sail to the Lacedaemonians to obtain protection because of their kinship. So he who cast out many without a burial was unmourned, for he had no funeral of his own, nor did he share a place in the tomb of his fathers. So he ends up on the run. He's not able to solidify any kind of government because he's just gone out and slaughtered a whole bunch of his own people. So no one will accept him as king. Okay. So verse 11, news of Jason's attempted revolution, even though it didn't go so well, news of it gets back to King Antiochus. You can imagine how he's going to feel about that. When the news of what happened reached King Antiochus, he took it to mean that Judea was in revolt. So inwardly he became like a wild beast, left Egypt and took the city in war. So he doesn't take this to just mean, oh, that guy I made high priest got a little uppity, I need to go take care of him. He says this must be the whole province of Judea rising up. Right? So he says, well, we need to take care of that. And so instead of coming to Jerusalem and just trying to make peace and stop the revolution, etc., he comes and attacks Jerusalem. As if it's a city he's trying to conquer. Okay. Verse 12, he commanded his soldiers to cut down without mercy whomever they met and to slaughter those who went into their houses. So there was a killing of young and old, a killing of boys, women, and children, and a slaughtering of virgins and infants. 80,000 were destroyed in a total of 3 days, 40,000 in hand-to-hand combat, and no fewer were sold into slavery than were slain. Okay. Now that 40,000 of them in hand-to-hand combat, what does that mean? That means the other 40,000 were executed. Right? 40,000 were killed in fighting in the streets. The other 40,000 were just slaughtered. That would probably include the children, a lot of the women, elderly people. Okay? So this is a massacre. He comes in and just massacres the people of the city of Jerusalem. Verse 15, not satisfied with these things, Antiochus dared to enter the most holy temple in all the earth. He had as his guide Menelaus, who had become a traitor both to the laws and to his country. With defiled hands he took the holy vessels, and with profane hands he pulled down the things dedicated by other kings to increase the glory and honor of the place. Antiochus was haughty, but was unaware that because of the sins of those who lived in the city, the Lord was momentarily angered, and therefore was withholding grace as a temporary punishment of the place. So already the author of 2 Maccabees is sort of telling us, in case you're already starting to think, well, God, why would God let that happen? Right? Well, the author of 2 Maccabees makes clear, because of the way the people of Israel had behaved, because of them following after the Greeks and their pagan ways instead of following the teachings that God had given them. He says, you guys want to be Greeks? Here's your Greek king. Enjoy. Verse 18, however, if the people of the city had not been involved in so many sins, this man would have been scourged and brought to ruin as soon as he had come, as was Heliodorus, whom Seleucus the king had sent to inspect the treasury. But the Lord did not choose the nation because of the place, but the place because of the nation. Therefore, the place here is referring to the temple. For the place also itself shared in the misfortunes that befell the nation, and later had a share in its benefits. And what was forsaken in the wrath of the Almighty was restored again in all its glory by the reconciliation of the great Lord. So he feels the need to let us know, oh, and by the way, things are going to get better later. Okay. Verse 21, at any rate, Antiochus carried off 1,800 talents from the temple and hurried away to Antioch. In his arrogance, he thought he could sail on the land and walk on the sea because of the lifting up of his heart. That's a nice euphemism for how proud he was. He thought he could sail on land and walk on the ocean. But he also left governors to afflict the people. In Jerusalem he left Philip, a Phrygian by race, more barbarous in character than the one who appointed him. And in Gerizim, Andronicus. Remember, Gerizim is the center of where the Samaritans are living. In addition to these, he left Menelaus, who lorded it over his fellow citizens worse than did the others, having a hateful disposition toward the Jewish citizens. Antiochus sent Apollonius, commander of the Mysians, with an army of 22,000 men, with orders to slaughter all the grown men and to sell the women and young boys as slaves. After he arrived in Jerusalem and pretended to be peace-loving, this man waited until the holy day of the Sabbath. Then, finding the Jews not at work, he commanded his men to take up arms. He put to the sword all those who came out to see them. Then he rushed into the city with his armed men and killed great numbers of people. But Judas Maccabeus, with about 9 others, withdrew into the desert so as not to share in the defilement. He kept himself and those with him alive in the mountains, as do wild animals, by continually eating food that grew wild. So this has been a little more expanded telling. We saw this in 1 Maccabees. This is that thing that was called in 1 Maccabees the abomination of desolation. Antiochus Epiphanes, he came into the temple, slaughtered all those people in the city, and then came into the temple and replaced the altar of God with the altar of Zeus, sacrificed a pig on it to Zeus. You know, the idea of turning it into a Greek city. And then this slaughter is the slaughter that we read about real briefly in 1 Maccabees. It was sort of a turning point in 1 Maccabees, where initially, when the Syrian army came, they decided to attack on the Sabbath because they knew the Jews weren't supposed to take up arms on the Sabbath, and slaughtered many of them. And in 1 Maccabees, we read how Judas Maccabeus and his followers, after they escaped, said, well, we're not letting that happen to us. Right? And that was in 1 Maccabees, that was actually the beginning of the turn in the bad direction. right? Because those people who were slaughtered essentially said, and we're going to see some more of this immediately coming up, essentially said, even if we get killed for it, we're going to follow God's teaching as to what we should do. Right? And if he says we shouldn't make war on the Sabbath, we're not going to make war on the Sabbath. And hopefully he'll protect us for that, but even if he doesn't, we're going to do what he commands. Okay? You see already with the shift when they see that and say, we're not going to be suckers like that. Right? You immediately see the beginning of what's later going to lead them to make alliances with Rome, make alliances with Sparta down the line. It's self-preservation kicks in. Right? It's we need to defend the nation, preserve the nation ourselves, rather than trusting God to do it. But this isn't, again, just a one-shot deal. It's not as if he comes in and does this one horrible thing in Jerusalem and then leaves them alone. Okay? It's in chapter 6. Not long afterward, the king sent an Athenian senator to compel the Jews to leave behind the laws of their fathers and not to live by the laws of God. He also insisted they pollute the temple in Jerusalem by calling it the temple of Olympian Zeus, and to call the one in Gerizim the temple of Zeus the Hospitable, as did the people who lived at one time in that place. Okay, so he not only has it in for the Jews, he has it in for the Samaritans to boot. Remember when Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman at the well, and she talks about how, well, my people worship on Mount Gerizim, and your people worship in the temple of Jerusalem. Well, for Antiochus Epiphanes, he wants to desecrate both and make both of them temples to Zeus. The intensity of evil was hard to deal with and extremely hateful, for the temple was filled with debauchery and reveling by the Gentiles, who relaxed with friends and had intercourse with women within the sacred precincts, and still further brought unfitting things inside. We talked before about how this pagan worship, we have an idea from our worship services, right, that you might go back and think, oh, well, they're just going and sitting in pews and singing songs to Baal and right, praying to Baal. That's not how it worked, right? That's not at all how it worked. Zeus, being a storm god like Baal, a big part of the whole storm and rain god, a big piece of that was crop fertility. That's why all these cultures worshipped storm gods, these Mediterranean cultures, because they depended on the storms coming off the sea bringing rain to get crops. Okay, and so all of these storm gods had rituals designed essentially to manipulate the god into giving you rain. And if you want fertile land, right, their analogy for fertility was sexual intercourse. And so we read before them talking about temple prostitutes. The idea that there were people in the temple whose sole job was farmers would come in, make a donation to the temple, and then have sexual intercourse with one of these temple prostitutes in order to guarantee that he would have fertile crops for the next year. Okay? So when they decide to turn the temple in Jerusalem into a temple to Zeus, that's what they start doing there. Okay, so those temple courts, those outer areas that we saw when we were talking about the building of the temple that were used originally for the priests to live in, now have become essentially a brothel. Right? And the detestable things they're talking about bringing in is now they're bringing in pigs primarily for animal sacrifices to Zeus. Okay, so this doesn't look like any worship service any of us, hopefully, that any of us have ever been at, right? It's a very different thing. There's slaughtering animals and there's fornication orgies going on. Okay, so verse 6, a man could neither keep the Sabbath nor observe the feasts of his fathers, nor simply confess himself to be a Jew. When the month came for the king's birthday, the Jews were led by bitter constraint to partake of the sacrifices. And when the feast of Dionysus came, they were forced to walk in procession for Dionysus wearing ivy wreaths. Okay, so king's birthday comes, he commands there be all these pagan sacrifices, right? He says, Jews aren't accepted. Right? The Jews aren't accepted. And you have to understand, in Greco-Roman religion, as I said, the rituals were to try to manipulate the god into doing what you wanted, right? And it's easy for us to look down on that, but a lot of my prayers, at least, are trying to get God to do what I want him to do. Please, God, don't, but it's trying to manipulate the gods into doing what they wanted. And so, if, for example, right, the king's birthday, they go and offer all these sacrifices, this is to make the gods happy with the king, so that the king will have a long life, right, and so that the king will be successful in battle. Okay. Well, so what do you think would happen if that's your religious worldview, and the king goes into battle and he loses? Well, he lost, so the gods must not have been happy with the king, right? Well, why was that? Didn't we offer all the sacrifices? Oh, wait. There's this group of people who refused to offer sacrifices for the king. They're why we lost. Okay? And so that happens here with the Jews, and throughout the early history of the Roman Empire, for the first 300 years AD, that happens to Christians in the Roman Empire, because the Christians refuse to participate in the sacrifices. And so anything that goes wrong in the empire, invariably, the Christians would get blamed and would get attacked and would be, and so we don't understand, from our perspective, why would the Romans go and keep killing all these Christians and torturing them and trying to get them to renounce Christ? Why? Just let them go do what they want. Well, from the Roman perspective, and here from the Greek perspective, right, they're dishonoring the pagan gods. And so if there's disease or a famine or they lose in a war, it's their fault for not worshiping the pagan gods correctly. Okay.
I thought when we talked about it at the very beginning, the difference between the Hebrew God with the Hebrews was that he interacted directly with the people. He cared about them.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like the pagan gods, they were just off doing their own god things.
Yeah.
And they didn't interact with the people. But this makes it sound like the people sort of think the gods are.
Well, it's that you have to try to get their attention. Because they don't really care that much. Right? Like nobody's going to walk around saying they have a personal relationship with Zeus. Right? Nobody says what a friend we have in Zeus. because Zeus lives up in the sky somewhere and doesn't really care, right? But the idea was that if you could sort of quote unquote make enough noise, right? Do something super significant, like build a giant statue of Zeus. You had to always do something big, right? Or sacrifice thousands of cattle, And so they keep trying to one up these things. That you could get their attention sort of momentarily, and he might be pleased. He might say, "Oh, look at it! Yeah, I'll send him some rain." Right? But then just as quick, he might strike you with lightning the next week, right? Because he doesn't really care. Okay, he doesn't love. There's no idea that Zeus or Apollo or any of these guys love any of the people. Zeus, there's legends about him fornicating with some of the people, but that's a whole different. There's no love or interaction in that way. And it's sort of like remember Elijah with the prophets of Baal. Remember when they were trying to get Baal to light their sacrifice on fire? And they started out yelling and screaming and dancing. And eventually they started cutting themselves. And you're going, what's with all that? They were trying to get his attention. Right? Remember Elijah was sort of teasing them. It's like, well, maybe he's in the bathroom. Maybe he's taking a nap. Give him a few minutes. Maybe he'll come and he'll. So that's the difference, right? You're not going to see like in Deuteronomy, where God says, I love you, I want to bless you. If you offend me and then repent, I will receive you back. You're not going to see anything like that issued from. The Greek gods, for example, they have oracles. When they want to hear something, they don't have any kind of scriptures, right? They have oracles. The most famous one is the oracle at Delphi, right? And who was possessed by Apollo. And you would go, and basically the oracle would tell you some kind of riddle. I mean, it's like a fortune cookie. Give you some kind of riddle that you were supposed to derive some meaning from your life. Right? So the Greek gods were always sort of playing games with people. Now, if you read the mythology, it's sometimes literally playing games with people. And, so there's a big difference in that way. Okay? And the only people who would claim to have any kind of personal interaction with the gods were some of the emperors who were insane. And I say that literally, like Caligula. Caligula had a big anvil put in his palace, and he'd go out there and bang on it during thunderstorms, saying he was talking to Zeus. But even the Romans at the time thought he was insane for doing that. Even the pagan Romans didn't think that was legitimate, that even the emperor would, let alone your average run-of-the-mill guy on the street. The gods didn't even know he existed. Okay, so because of their belief system, they're forcing the Jews to take part in these pagan festivals. Dionysus, the second example they gave, is Bacchus in Rome, is the god of wine and drinking. And his celebrations were essentially, there'd be these street processions that it mentions, where they would wear these wreaths, and people would go out and they would literally drink in the streets until they became temporarily insane, was the idea. Except more violent. Except with a lot of killings. Mardi Gras without a police department. Just as much sex plus violence. Okay, they described it as being possessed by these Dionysian spirits, they called them.
Probably right.
That's when St. Paul starts talking about in his epistles, when he says things like all the gods of the nations are demons. Right? Your average pagan Greek would have read that and nodded and not understood why that was a problem. Okay, because they talk about people. Socrates, in one of Plato's dialogues, says that he's possessed by a demon. He just says so. He says he's possessed by a demon that whispers wisdom to his soul. Right? And that was not weird to them. I was like, well, yeah, he is pretty wise. He must be. Would have been there. Right? So that's very foreign to us. But that's why, for example, there's that story in the book of Acts where there's the slave girl who's the fortune teller. And Paul and Barnabas cast the demon out of her. And her owners get all mad. Because they're like, now how are we going to make a living? She can't tell fortunes now that she's not demon possessed. And you're like, that's weird. That was accepted in their culture, that there were people possessed by these spirits, and those people were considered special and blessed. It wasn't considered a bad thing. Okay, so verse 8, moreover, a decree laid down by Ptolemy was sent to the nearby Greek cities. Remember, Ptolemy is the king in Egypt. That the same manner of conduct be imposed on the Jews to partake of the sacrifices, but they should slaughter those who chose not to change over to the Greek customs. One could see, therefore, their present misery. For instance, there were 2 women brought for circumcising their children. They publicly paraded these women around the city with their babes hanging from their breasts. Then they threw them down from the city wall. Others who came together in the nearby caves to keep the Sabbath day secretly were betrayed to Philip and were all burned together, because they piously kept themselves from crying out for help on account of their regard for the most holy day. Okay, so there's just a couple of fairly hideous examples. Okay. Verse 12, now I urge those who read this book not to be discouraged by these calamities, but to recognize that these punishments were for the discipline of our people, but not for their destruction. For it is an act of great kindness for the Lord not to allow our people to act ungodly for long, but to punish them immediately. But the Lord does not act the same way with other nations. He waits patiently until they attain the completion of their sins, then punishes them. Thus he does not judge us in this way, so as to take vengeance on us afterwards when we have reached the end of our sinning. For this very reason he never withdraws his mercy from us. Although he disciplines us with calamities, he does not abandon his own people. Let what I have said serve as a reminder, but we must continue the narrative. So this is another one of those pauses to reflect. Now this is something interesting that he points out, difference between the way God interacts with his people than the way he acts with other nations in general. So remember, we've seen since all the way back in Exodus, remember they're coming into the land, God says to them, the cup of the iniquity of the Canaanites is full. Saw it even before that with Sodom and Gomorrah. The cup of their iniquities is full. Where they had sinned to a point where now judgment was coming. God's judgment was coming. They'd be wiped out completely. Right? Just wiped out completely. And there were other nations when they were coming into the land, like the Moabites and the Ammonites, where God said their cup of iniquity is not yet full. Right? He said they've done some wickedness, but they haven't reached the point of my judgment yet. Okay? And we could go all through history, look at various nations and see. Most recently to this, we talked about the Phoenicians who were sacrificing their infants to Molech. Right? Well, the Romans obliterated them from the face of the earth. Okay, so that time came and they're gone. And so what the writer is saying here is, there's an important difference between that and how God works with his people. With his people, when they sin, he calls them to account right away. Why is that? He wants them to repent. He wants them to repent. He doesn't sit and wait for his people to get to the point where they've earned their destruction. Right? He pulls them up short now. And St. Paul's going to summarize that by saying, God disciplines every son whom he loves. Okay. We sometimes think that if we're good Christian people, our whole life should just go swimmingly. Right? Like, I'm a good Christian person. I should never get sick. I should never have any problems in my family. I should never have any problems at work. Right? Because I follow Jesus, right? The point is, just the opposite is true. The point is, because we love God and God loves us, right? He's going to discipline us. He's going to show us when we're going the wrong way. He's going to correct us to try and get us on the road that's best for us. The same way that parents, every kid wants parents who will never discipline them. Right? They think. Right? But if you ever meet parents who never discipline their children, you'd be hard-pressed to say that they really love their children. Parents who have 14 and 15-year-old kids who are out somewhere and they don't know where and they don't care, is that a parent who loves their child? Is that because, right? So the opposite is true. The opposite is true. The more a parent loves their child, the more serious they're going to be about disciplining their child and teaching their child the right way to go. Same is true of God with us. The closer we get to God, the more serious he becomes. The more serious we become about him, the more serious he becomes about us. And making sure that we're going on the right way. Okay, so verse 18. Eleazar, one of the scribes in high position, a man already advanced in years and of a noble presence, was forced to open his mouth and to eat swine's flesh. But welcoming an honorable death rather than a defiled life, he spat out the flesh and approached the rack of his own accord. That's the torture rack. He did as men should do who refuse what is not lawful to eat, even for the love of life. Those in charge of the unlawful sacrifice, because of their long-time acquaintance with him, took the man aside privately and urged him to bring meat proper for him to use, pretending to prepare it for himself as though he were eating the flesh of the sacrifice commanded by the king. So they respect him, right? They respect him. So they pull him aside and say, hey, just bring some beef. Bring down some lamb. We'll cook it up. It'll look like you're eating the sacrifice. You don't have to eat the pork, right? You don't need to die over this, right? You don't need to die over this. Verse 22, thus by doing this he might be saved from death and be treated kindly on account of his long friendship with them. But making an honorable resolve worthy of his years and the dignity of his old age and gray hair, which he had reached through the distinction of his excellent life even from childhood. And moreover, according to the holy God-given laws, he turned himself over to them quickly, telling them to send him immediately to Hades. For to pretend such things, he said, is not worthy of our time of life, lest many of the young should suppose that Eleazar in his 90th year has gone over to a foreign religion. So he's 90 years old. And because of my pretense for the sake of living a brief moment longer, they should be led astray through me, while I earn only pollution and defilement in my old age. For even if for the present I should avoid the punishment of men, yet whether I live or die I shall not escape the hands of the Almighty. Therefore, by manfully giving up my life now, I will show myself worthy of my old age, and leave to the young a noble example of how to die a good death willingly and bravely for the venerable and holy laws. So here we see the opposite. Now this is the beginning. This is the beginning of the idea of martyrdom.
How come more people name their kids Eliezer?
Well, there is, and we're going to meet some more martyrs here in the next couple chapters. There are icons of the Maccabean martyrs. They make a great Hanukkah gift to confuse your Jewish friends. But there are icons of the Maccabean martyrs. And this is the beginning of this idea. This is the beginning of this idea. And this is very important in terms of how the Jewish people understand their faith as their understanding increases and we come closer to Christ appearing on this earth. Right? Because when the law was first given, in most of the history we read, all of the concern was on the community. Right? It was Israel or Judah. It was the whole community. And the whole community needed to follow God's law. Right? And if the community didn't, then the whole community was judged. And so if someone was disobeying God's law, either that person had to repent or they had to be tossed out. Right? Those were the two options. Well, now, consider, for a couple hundred years, they haven't had their own nation. They've been scattered. There's Jews living in Egypt, Jews living in what's now Turkey, Jews living in Babylon still, in Mesopotamia, Jews who have come back to Judea who are under a Greek king. Okay? So they haven't had a country. Right? They're scattered. They haven't had just one community. And so their understanding of the Torah, of the laws, has changed. Okay? Now, I don't think this is really a new idea, because we saw all the way back in Deuteronomy God talking about people needing to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Well, that's obviously not talking about a big group of people. That's talking about a person, right? Because a big group of people doesn't have one big heart, right? They don't have one big mind. They don't have one big... Okay, that's how you... So it always was aimed at the person. But they've come to understand that now. They've come to understand that this isn't just about me getting in trouble with the law, like the police. This isn't just about whether the king is ruling wisely. This is about what's in my heart and whether I'm following God or not. Okay, so that was the first important step that living in exile they had to learn. That this wasn't just politics, right? That this was their own personal heart and their own personal morality. Okay? And now this is the next step. This is the next step. The next step is, therefore, even if I'm going to die as a result, it's my responsibility to stay loyal to God and to follow His teachings and His laws. Okay? These are people who, the way the monastic fathers describe it is, these are people who would rather die than sin. Okay. Exhibit A is this 90-year-old man who is going to be brutally tortured to death rather than eat a piece of pork. You want to talk about low on the list of laws, right? They're not telling him to murder somebody, right? They're not telling him to go commit adultery, any of the things that we think are bad sins. They're saying eat some pork, right? To get me to eat a McRib on a fast day, you don't have to threaten me with death. You pretty much just have to hand me a McRib, right? And I'll pretty much eat it on a fast day. I have a much lower threshold for sin. Right? But Eliezer, rather than eating pork, is willing to be tortured to death. To be tortured to death. Okay? And so this now represents a big shift who are the people who were the quote-unquote heroes in the Old Testament? Who a lot of these people were looking up to. Even in First Maccabees, right? Who are the people they were patterning themselves after? Like Phineas and Numbers, who went and killed the guy who was sleeping with a foreigner, right? Or David slaying Goliath, right? As these people who did these big epic deeds, right? Now who's our hero? 90-year-old, gray-haired scribe who spent his whole life copying books. This is our hero now. Why? Because he would rather die than commit even a little dinky sin. Even a little tiny sin. Okay. And at the end of verse 28, after he said this, he went straight to the rack. And those who had just demonstrated goodwill toward him now showed hostility because they took the words he had spoken to be madness. When he was about to die from the blows, he groaned and said, "It is evident to the Lord in his holy knowledge that though I could have been saved from death, I am enduring terrible sufferings in my body from this beating. But in my soul I gladly suffer these things because I fear him." So in this manner he died, leaving in his death an example of his noble character and a memorial of his virtue, not only to the young but to the many people of his nation. Now, word itself, martyr, that's what it looks like in Greek, actually means witness. It means witness. It doesn't refer directly to anybody dying or suffering. Okay? Because as you see in this passage, the importance, right, when they say, well, why don't you go and eat some other meat? Right? What is his response? If I do that, number one, it's going to bring shame on me, but number two, all the younger people are going to see that. And what are they going to say? What message are they going to take from that? Right? What is that going to be a witness to? And so now when he refuses and he dies, what is he a witness to? Right? And so this is going to be the idea when we get into the first martyr in the New Testament, St. Stephen in the book of Acts. Right? Who got stoned to death rather than denying Christ. And all through all the thousands of martyrs, the history of the church. Okay, so chapter 7, some more examples. It came about also that 7 brothers with their mother were arrested and forced by the king to be bound and tortured with whips and cords until they partook of the unlawful swine's flesh. One of them, acting as spokesman, said, "What do you intend to ask and learn from us? For we are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of our fathers." The king became enraged and commanded that pans and cauldrons be heated. These were heated immediately, and he commanded them to cut out the spokesman's tongue and to scalp him and cut off his hands and feet while the rest of the brothers and the mother watched. When he was utterly helpless, the king ordered them to take him to the fire while he was still breathing and to fry him in a pan. As the smoke from the pan spread out broadly, the brothers and their mother encouraged one another to die bravely, saying, "The Lord God is taking notice of us, and in truth is encouraging us, as Moses proclaimed in his song which he sang, bearing witness against the people to their faces, and God will have compassion on his servants." Okay? So this shows you the level they're going to. What is this testament? Why is the king so angry? Right? Well, essentially, what they're saying to him is, you can call yourself Epiphanes all you want. Right? Your son can call himself Savior all you want. But you're not really the king. Right? That's what they're saying to him. You're not really the king, and your laws, who cares? Right? Our God is the king. And the same thing is going to happen in the Roman Empire. Because Christians are going to say, Jesus is Lord. And that's going to be, by the way, that means Caesar isn't. Right? Caesar isn't. And that's why he's so mad. Remember all the way back to Pharaoh in Exodus, remember? The Pharaoh was the one who had the power of life and death. Well, we saw through the plagues, maybe not. Right? Maybe not. God taught him a lesson. Well, the same thing's going on here. Right? So that's how the first brother died. Verse 7, after the first brother died in this manner, they brought forward the second for their sport. They tore away the skin of his head with the hair and asked him, will you eat pork rather than have your body punished limb by limb? But he replied in the language of his fathers and said to them, no. He won't even answer them in Greek. Therefore this brother in turn underwent the same torture as the first. So when he was at his last breath, he said, you accursed wretch, you set us free from this present life, but the King of the world will raise us to an everlasting renewal of life, because we die for his laws. If you didn't notice, that's the first reference we've read to people being raised from the dead. Okay? Because part of what's happening while the people are in exile, we talked about how they're starting to see God's teaching and his laws referring to them in particular, not just to the community. Well, that means that God's promises aren't just about God bringing this particular group of people back to this particular strip of land. Right? Because how is that a promise to me? Oh, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson, 23 times removed, will have a nice vineyard. Oh, well, good. Right? How's that? That's not a promise to me for faithfulness. Right? And that's not what we see when we look at like the life of David. David was faithful to God, mostly. Repented when he wasn't. And God was faithful to David. Not just to his descendants, but to David. Okay? And so they're going to understand these prophecies as not being about the restoration of a country, bringing a country back to a strip of land, but about the restoration of us as people. Right? This means that if I am faithful to God, even though nobody's clear on how this works, and we're going to see, there are some more mentions of this, that there's not going to be a lot of, because we're before Christ died and rose from the dead, so nobody's, but this idea that even if I am killed and I go into Hades, I go into Sheol, I go into the realm of the dead, right? If I was faithful to God when I went there, he's going to be faithful to me somehow once I'm there. And he's going to correct this situation. We talked about how justice in the Old Testament, is things are out of whack. And now God's going to put them back in order. Okay, well, this evil man killing this good man, things are out of whack. So somehow, this good man is going to have to be restored. And something real bad is going to have to happen to this evil man to get things back in line. And so that's what he's professing here. It's like, look, you can kill me, but I know that because I've been faithful to God, even though I'm dead, he's going to be faithful to me.
And that's why Maccabees books are not in the Hebrew Bible.
No, we'll get to that in a little bit. That's coming up. Verse 10, after him the third fell prey to their sport. When it was demanded, he quickly put out his tongue and courageously stretched forth his hands, and said bravely, I received these from heaven, and because of his laws I disregard them, and from him I hope to get them back again. As a result, the king himself and those with him were astonished at the young man's spirit, for he regarded his sufferings as nothing. When he died, they tortured and tormented the fourth in the same way. So when he was near death, he said, one may be chosen to die at the hands of men, and to look for the hope that God gives of being raised again by him. But for you there shall be no resurrection to life. That's that. These things are going to get put back in order. Verse 15, next they led forward the fifth and tormented him. But he looked at the king and said, because you have authority among men, mortal though you are, you do what you please. But do not think that God has forsaken our people. Continue and behold how his mighty power will torture you and your seed. Right? So he says, by doing this, this is going to come back on you and on your descendants. Now remember back in 1 Maccabees, remember all the assassinations and the killing and the... right? So we saw how that came back. Verse 18, after him they led forward the sixth. When he was about to die, he said, do not deceive yourself, for we are suffering these things on our own account because of our sins against our own God. Therefore things worthy of wonder have happened. But do not think that you shall be innocent for trying to fight against God. The mother was especially admirable and worthy of good memory. Though she saw her 7 sons perish in the span of a single day, She bore it courageously because of her hope in the Lord. You can imagine for a minute this woman watching all 7 of her sons one by one being tortured and murdered in front of her. She encouraged each of them in the language of their fathers. Filled with a noble spirit, she stirred her womanly reasoning with manly courage, saying to them, I do not know how you came into being in my womb. It was not I who gave you breath and life, nor I who arranged you and ordered the elements within each of you. Therefore the Creator of the world, who formed man in the beginning and devised the origin of all things, will give both breath and life back to you again in his mercy, since you now disregard yourselves for the sake of his laws. Antiochus, supposing that he was being treated with contempt and suspected her speech was insulting him personally. Now picture this. He's just tortured and murdered 7 of this woman's sons in front of her. And he's the one who's insecure. Right? He's the one who's like, hey, are you saying bad things about me? Right? So you can see how even this roles have switched, right? Who's really in charge of this situation? Who's teaching who, right? Thus, since the youngest brother was still alive, not only did he appeal to him in words, but at the same time guaranteed him with oaths that he would make him rich and enviable if he would turn away from his fathers, and that he would consider him a friend and entrust him with public affairs. But when the young man refused to pay any attention to him, the king called his mother to him and urged her to advise the boy to save himself. After much urging from him, she agreed to persuade her son. But she leaned close to him and mocked the cruel tyrant, speaking in their native tongue, saying, My son, have mercy on me. I carried you for 9 months in my womb and nursed you for 3 years. I reared you and brought you up to this point in your life and have taken care of you. I beseech you, my child, to look at heaven and earth and see everything in them and know that God made them out of nothing. So also he made the race of man in this way. Do not fear this executioner, but be worthy of your brothers and accept death, that in God's mercy I may receive you back again with your brothers. So she tries to get the mother to talk him out of it. Instead, she says, look, we're talking about the God who created everything you could see out of nothing, created you out of nothing, right? Don't think he can't, if we stay faithful to him, that he can't bring something good out of this. Verse 30, while she continued speaking, the young man said to the king, What are you waiting for? I will not obey the king's command, but I obey the command of the law given to our fathers through Moses. But you who have invented all manner of evil against the Hebrews will not escape the hands of God, for we are suffering because of our own sins. So if for the sake of reproof and discipline our living Lord is angry for a little while, he will again be reconciled with his own servants. But you, O unholy man, and most defiled of all men, do not be elated in vain and puffed up by uncertain hopes when you raise your hand against the children of heaven. You have not yet escaped the judgment of the Almighty, all-seeing God. For now our brothers have endured a brief suffering and then passed on into everlasting life under God's covenant. But you, by God's judgment, will receive just punishments for your haughtiness. Like my brothers, I give up body and soul for the laws of our fathers, crying out to God, that he may soon show his mercy to our nation, and by afflictions and calamities make you confess that he alone is God, and through my brothers and me bring to an end the wrath of the Almighty, which has justly come upon our entire nation. Then the king became bitterly enraged at his contempt and treated him worse than the others. So putting his trust completely in the Lord, he died in his innocence. Last of all, the mother died after her sons. Let this be enough then about the eating of sacrifices and the extreme tortures. This is the last example. So this gives you an idea of, in First Maccabees, it talked about how they were persecuted and killed if they didn't follow the law. This is, again, up close. This is what that really meant in the lives of the actual people there. This is what they were called to do. This is what was spurring Judas Maccabeus on. Right? When he's out in the wilderness putting an army together. Right, to try to put an end to this. Okay? And so that's where we pick up in chapter 8. But Judas, also called Maccabeus, remember that means the hammer, and those with him secretly infiltrated the villages and summoned their kinsmen. They called together those who had continued in the Jewish religion and took them as companions, so they gathered about 6,000 men. They invoked the Lord to look upon the people who were trampled underfoot by all, to have compassion on the temple which had been profaned by ungodly men, to have mercy on the city which was being destroyed and was about to be leveled to the ground, and to hearken to the blood that cried out to him. Remember, that goes all the way back to, remember the story of Cain and Abel? When God comes to Cain, he says, Abel's blood cries out from the ground. And that's a central piece. That's a central piece of in Deuteronomy. God says he's going to demand an account for every human life. Let's end it. Every single one. Okay? So they're saying, God, look what's going on. There's a whole lot of blood right now being spilled. They also invoked him to remember the lawless destruction of the sinless babies and the blasphemies committed against his name, and to show his hatred of evil. As soon as Maccabees had his army in order, he was not to be withstood by the Gentiles, for the wrath of the Lord had turned to mercy. He came without notice to towns and villages and set them on fire. At opportune times he regained places and put to flight not a few of the enemy. He found the night the best time for such hostilities, so talk of his manliness spread everywhere. Manliness is probably not the best translation of that. Valor is probably better. The word virtue comes from the Latin word, which actually in Latin meant manliness. But the idea of virtue is probably better. That he was a man not to be messed with. Manliness. It's not like, he has a hairy chest or something. I don't know what manliness is supposed to be. Verse 8, when Philip realized that Judas was making progress little by little and that he was advancing with more frequent efficiency, he wrote to Ptolemy, the governor of Coele and Phoenicia, for aid to the king's government. And Ptolemy quickly appointed Nicanor, the son of Patroclus, the foremost of his friends. He sent him in command of no fewer than 20,000 Gentiles of all nations to get rid of all the people of Judea. He sent Gorgias with him, a general and a man experienced in the affairs of war. Nicanor determined to make up for the king the taxes due to the Romans, 2,000 talents, from the capture of the Jews. He immediately sent word to the cities by the sea, inviting them to buy Jewish slaves and promising to hand over 90 slaves for a talent, not expecting that the judgment of the Almighty was about to fall upon him. Okay, so we talked about how the Romans had just wiped out the Phoenicians in North Africa, in Carthage, the last refuge. Remember, this is King Ptolemy, who's the king of Egypt. So he's now got a border with the Romans. So not only does he have the Syrians always causing trouble, the Romans are expanding into his territory. So he owes some tribute money to the Romans. Right? So he says, well, this will be a good way to make it up. Right? We need to take care of these Jews. I can just have my men, when they go in there and put down this little rebellion, round up some slaves. Right? We could sell them and use the money to pay off the Romans. So verse 12, now word came to Judas concerning Nicanor's impending attack, and when he told those with him about the arrival of the army, those who were cowardly and distrustful of God's justice ran off and removed themselves from that place. Okay, so he's got his band that's going around doing these guerrilla attacks. Word comes they're sending an actual army after him and a good group of his men. Well, it's nice knowing you, Judas. Good luck. Verse 14, others sold all their remaining property, and at the same time entreated the Lord to rescue those sold by the ungodly Nicanor before he even met them. They entreated him not for their own sake, but for the sake of the covenants made with their fathers, and because they were called by his holy and magnificent name. But Maccabees gathered those around him, 6,000 in number, and exhorted them neither to be panic-stricken by the enemy, nor to fear the great multitude of Gentiles who were unjustly coming against them, but to contend bravely. So he's outnumbered 20,000 to 6,000. And these 20,000 aren't people who decided to rebel, who used to be farmers and what have you. These 20,000 are trained, experienced soldiers. Okay. Verse 17, he also exhorted them to keep before their eyes the lawless outrage committed against the holy place by the Gentiles, and the torture of the mocked city, and still more the dissolution of their ancestral way of life. For they trust in arms and bold acts, he said, but we trust in Almighty God, who with only one nod is able to overthrow both those who come against us and the entire world. He also spoke to them of the times help came to their forefathers, how the 185,000 perished under Sennacherib, and how in the time when the battle took place in Babylonia against the Galatians, 8,000 in all entered the fray, along with 4,000 Macedonians. But when the Macedonians were perplexed, the 8,000 destroyed the 120,000 because of the help that came to them from heaven. Then they took many spoils. With these words he gave them good courage and prepared them to die on behalf of their laws and their homeland. Then he divided his forces into 4 parts. Now notice, he's still not overweening in confidence. Right? He gets to this rousing speech about how, with God on their side, even though they're outnumbered, they can win. And then it says, by this great speech he prepared them to die. In the midst of their laws. So it looks as if they're setting up, we're about to get a bunch more martyrs. Right? We're about to get steamrolled. He appointed his brothers Simon and Joseph and Jonathan each to command a division, putting 1,500 soldiers under each. In addition, he appointed Eleazar to read aloud from the holy book and gave the watchword, the help of God. Then he led the first division himself and joined battle with Nicanor. When the Almighty became their ally, they slew more than 9,000 of the enemy and wounded and crippled most of Nicanor's army and forced them all to flee. They seized the money of those who came to buy them as slaves. After they pursued them for some distance, they were compelled to return because of the hour. Right? The only reason they stopped at 9,000 was it was getting late. So they thought they ought to get home. For they did not continue their pursuit because it was the day before the Sabbath. So when they had collected their arms and stripped the spoils from their enemy, they kept the Sabbath, greatly blessing and giving thanks to the Lord, who had brought them safely through the day and had appointed it for them as a beginning of mercy. Then after the Sabbath, they gave a portion of the spoils to those who were tortured and to the widows and orphans, and distributed the rest among themselves and their children. When they had done this, they made a common supplication and besought the merciful Lord to be reconciled at last with his servants. Okay, so at this point, remember we talked about how when Judas's brothers took over, things kind of went a different direction. At this point, at least, though, look what they do with all the money they seize. They use it to try to help the people who've been suffering under the Greeks. And then once they've done that, then they keep what's left. Verse 30, moreover, of the forces on the side of Timothy and Maccabees who contended against them, they killed more than 20,000 of them and became the masters of exceedingly high fortresses. They divided a great many spoils, giving shares equal to their own to those who had been tortured and to the orphans and widows and also to the aged. After they collected the enemy's weapons, they organized them all carefully in convenient places and carried the rest of the spoils to Jerusalem. They killed the commander of Timothy's forces, a most unholy man and one who had greatly troubled the Jews. While they were celebrating the victory in the city of their fathers, they burned those who had set fire to the temple gates, Callisthenes and some others, who had fled into one small house. So they received a recompense worthy of their impiety. The thrice sinful Nicanor, again, 2 Maccabees, he tells you what he thinks of people, had brought the 1,000 merchants for the purchase of the Jews. But he was humbled with the help of the Lord by the opponents he regarded as of the least account. Thus, after he succeeded primarily in the destruction of his own army, that's a great phrase, after succeeding primarily in destroying his own army, he took off his glorious military apparel and made his way inland alone like a fugitive till he reached Antioch. There he who had undertaken to establish taxes for the Romans by the capture of the people of Jerusalem proclaimed that the Jews had a defender, and therefore were invulnerable because they followed the laws appointed beforehand by him. Okay, so he ends up coming and testifying, right? He ends up coming and saying, you can't beat the Jews. Chapter 9. About that time it happened that Antiochus returned in dishonor from the region of Persia. So remember, he took a shot at some more territorial expansion out to the east this time, and it didn't go so well. For he had entered the city called Persepolis and attempted to rob the temples and control the city. Therefore, when the citizens rushed to the city's aid with arms, Antiochus and his men were routed. And it came about that Antiochus was put to flight by the citizens and made a shameful return home. So, at least Antiochus was equal opportunity with other religions. Right? He went after the Zoroastrians too, to try to make them convert and trash their temples. Now while he was in Ecbatana, news came to him about what had happened to Nicanor and the forces of Timothy. Swollen with rage, he supposed that he would also vent upon the Jews the evil done to him by those who had banished him. Wherefore he commanded his charioteer to drive without stopping to complete the journey. For the judgment of heaven came upon him. For in his arrogance he said, "When I arrive there, I will make Jerusalem a common burial place of the Jews." Okay, so basically he's saying, I'm going to turn Jerusalem into a mass grave when I get there. Okay, because again, he's blaming them for what happened. What happened is his military pursuits. But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him with an incurable and unseen plague. For as soon as he stopped speaking, a deadly pain seized him in his inward parts, with sharp internal torments. And this very justly, for he had tortured the inward parts of others with many and unusual afflictions. Yet by no means did he cease from his haughtiness, but was even more filled with arrogance, breathing fire in his rage against the Jews and giving orders to hasten the journey. So it came to pass that he fell out of his chariot as it rushed along, and the fall was so hard that it tortured every limb of his body. That torture really means broke or shattered. Okay, so he makes his threats against Jerusalem, gets his mother of all tummy aches. Right? That doesn't even stop him. He tells him we need to go faster. He ends up falling out and meeting his end. Verse 8, he who had just been thinking that he could command the waves of the sea because of his superhuman arrogance, and imagined he could weigh the high mountains in a balance, was brought down to earth and carried in a litter. So they pick, a litter is two poles with a piece of cloth between it, right? So this guy who thought he was so, now they're hauling him on what's left of him. Thus he conveyed plainly to all the manifest power of God. Accordingly, worms swarmed up from the ungodly man's body, and his flesh rotted away while he was still alive, anguishing and in pain. Because of his odor, the whole army was repulsed by his rottenness. So that whole breaking all his bones that didn't actually kill him, the wounds got infected. The wounds got infected, got gangrene, got full of maggots.
Yeah, they did smell.
It'd be interesting if they based a movie on it.
Actually, Mel Gibson has been talking for the last several years about making a movie out of Maccabees. So, and because it was a tolerable smell, no one was able to carry the man who a little while before thought he could touch the stars of heaven. That he was broken down and began to cease from much of his arrogance, as you might imagine at that point. And to come to a recognition of the divine scourge, for he was bent over with pain at every moment. When he could no longer endure his own stench, he spoke these words, "It is right to be subject to God, and no mortal should think that he is equal with God." Then this disgusting man, second Maccabees, this disgusting man prayed to the Lord who would no longer have mercy on him, saying that the holy city which he had been hastening to level to the ground and make into a common burial place, he was now proclaiming to be free. Moreover, the Jews, whom he did not consider worthy of a burial place, but to be thrown out along with their children for the wild animals and the birds to eat, he would make them all equals to citizens of Athens. Furthermore, the holy temple, which he had plundered in times past, he would adorn with the finest offerings, and restore many times over all the holy vessels, and the taxes assigned to the sacrifices he would pay from his own revenues. In addition to this, he also would become a Jew and visit every inhabited place to proclaim the might of God. Right? Does this sound like any, God, if you just get me out of this. But now what? It's too late. It's too late. Right? He had a few chances. Right? And now judgment has come upon him. Verse 18, but when his sufferings did not cease at all, for the judgment of God came upon him justly, he was driven to despair over what had happened to him. Thus he wrote the Jews the letter recorded below in the form of a supplication. It contained the following words. To the good Jewish citizens, Antiochus your king in general sends many greetings and good wishes for your health and welfare. If you and your children are strong and your interests are served, then I am glad. With my hope in heaven, I kindly remember your respect and goodwill. Now as I was returning home from the region of Persia, I was struck with a difficult illness, and now consider it necessary to be concerned about the common safety of all. But I am not giving up hope for myself, for I have great hope of escaping from this illness. Nevertheless, I observed that even my father, when he led his army into the upper countries, appointed his successor, that if anything unexpected should arise, or any unwelcome news should come, the people throughout the realm would not be troubled, for they would know to whom the government was left. So what he's saying is, I don't think I'm going to die from this. I'm just naming a successor, just in case, just as good form, in case rumors get out or something. In addition to this, I understand how the rulers close at hand and the neighbors of my kingdom keep watching for opportunities and waiting to see how things will turn out. Thus I have appointed my son Antiochus to be king. Oftentimes when I hastened off to the upper provinces, I had trusted and commended him to most of you. So I have written to him what is written here. Therefore I urge you and request that you remember my acts of kindness for both the common and private good, and maintain your present goodwill toward me and my son. For I am persuaded that he, following my policy, will treat you kindly and considerately. So the murderer and blasphemer suffered very grievously, as he had treated others, for he died a miserable death in the mountains of a foreign land. Then Philip, who grew up with him, took his body home, but fearing the son of Antiochus, he went instead to Ptolemy Philometor in Egypt. Okay, so his final letter is full of
Praise for himself.
Yeah. You remember my last visit and how pleasant it was, and everything. Okay, so he meets his end. And this is again, see, we've got pretty sharp contrast between him and the martyrs we read about. Right? Between him and Eliezer, their manner of death. Right? And part of the difference, remember back when we first started tonight, that difference between God's people and the other people. Right? With Eliezer, with the sons, with the woman. Right? They all said, whatever punishment we're enduring is for our own sins. They all said God's judgment is just. Right? With them, God disciplined them and would reward them. Right? With Antiochus, God waits and just lets it pile up. Lets it pile up until the time comes where, no, this is judgment now. Right? We saw that, the same thing with Pharaoh. Pharaoh, Moses kept going to him, and he kept hardening his heart. After a certain point, there was no turning back. After a certain point, now Pharaoh was in for the full judgment of God. Okay. So chapter 10, with the Lord leading them on, Maccabees and those with him received back the temple and the city. They took down the altars fabricated in the marketplace by the foreigners and also destroyed the sacred precincts. When they had purified the temple, they made another altar, and striking fire out of stones, they offered sacrifices, the first in 2 years. They offered incense and lit lamps and set out the bread of the presence. When they had done this, they fell prostrated, besought the Lord so as never again to fall into such calamities. But if they should ever sin, they might be chastised by him with gentleness, and not be handed over to blasphemous and barbarous nations. It happened on the anniversary of the same day the temple was profaned by the foreigners. And the purification of the temple took place on the 25th day of the same month, which was Chislev. They celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the Feast of Tabernacles, remembering how a short time before they had spent the feast living in mountains and caves like wild animals. So, what feast is this again? This is Hanukkah. Yeah, this is Hanukkah. Celebrating the relighting of the candles in the temple and its rededication. Verse 7, therefore carrying ivy-wreathed wands, beautiful olive branches, and even palm branches, they offered hymns of praise to him who made possible the purifying of his own place. They decreed by a common edict and vote that the whole Jewish nation should celebrate these days every year. Such then was the end of Antiochus, called Epiphanes. Verse 10, now we will tell what took place under Antiochus Eupator, the son of that ungodly man, and will set forth and encompass briefly the calamities of the wars. For this man inherited the kingdom and appointed a certain Lysias as chief governor of Coele and Phoenicia. Then Ptolemy, called Macron, led the way in protecting the rights of the Jews because of the wrongdoing that happened to them, and he attempted to maintain peaceful relations with them. For this reason he was accused before Eupator by the king's friends. He heard himself called a traitor at every turn because he abandoned Cyprus, entrusted to him by Philometor, and defected to Antiochus Epiphanes. Since he could not exercise his noble authority honorably, he took poison and ended his life. So the one Greek official who tried to help the Jews out, who felt some compassion for them after everything they'd just been through, ends up being called a traitor by everyone. He's a traitor to the Egyptians, he's a traitor to the Syrians, and so he ends up committing suicide. Verse 14, when Gorgias became governor of the region, remember this is the Gorgias who was the military commander who came and attacked Judas Maccabeus. He's now made governor of the area. This can't go well, right? By Antiochus' son. He maintained mercenary troops and attacked the Jews at every turn. At the same time, the Idumeans, in possession of vital strongholds, were harassing the Jews. They received fugitives from Jerusalem and endeavored to keep up the war. The Idumeans are from the area south of Judea into the Arabian desert. So the Idumeans are one of the groups. The Idumeans and the Nabateans are the two biggest groups of Arab nomads at this time. So what this is saying is, Gorgias is the governor. He's got mercenary troops that he's mainly using to harass Judas Maccabeus, partially out of revenge, partly to keep himself in power. At the same time, he's got the Idumeans in the south sort of raiding his territory. But Maccabeus and his men made supplication and implored God to be their ally, and rushed against the strongholds of the Idumeans. They attacked them aggressively, gained possession of the places, and drove back all who fought upon the wall. They slaughtered everyone they encountered, killing no fewer than 20,000. But at least 9,000 fled into two very strong towers, which were well equipped, containing everything necessary to withstand a siege. So Maccabeus left behind Simon, Joseph, and also Zacchaeus and those with him, a force sufficient to besiege them. Then he went to more urgent places. This Zacchaeus, of course, is not the short one. But this is who the Zacchaeus of the New Testament was probably named after. Verse 20, but those around Simon who were money lovers were bribed by some of those in the towers. When they had received 70,000 drachmas, they allowed some of them to slip away. When news of what happened reached Maccabeus, he gathered the leaders of the people and accused them of selling their brothers for money by releasing their enemies to fight against them. Then he killed these men who had become traitors and immediately seized the two towers. Faring well at arms in everything he undertook, he destroyed more than 20,000 in the two fortresses. Now Timothy, who had been defeated previously by the Jews, gathered a very massive and powerful force of mercenaries and assembled cavalry from Asia in no small number. Then he arrived as though he would take Judea captive. Okay, so remember our other commander, Timothy, Gorgias now has become the governor. If you're wondering what Timothy was doing, he didn't take that loss well either. And he's gone out and hired mercenaries, particularly Asian cavalry. Okay, so we've got horsemen and probably some elephants. Right? We read about the elephants in 1 Maccabees. And he's now coming to put down the rebellion in Judea. Verse 25, as he drew near, Maccabeus and his men made supplication to God as they sprinkled earth on their heads and girded their loins with sackcloth. They fell prostrate before the foot of the altar and implored him to be merciful to them and to be an enemy to their enemies and an adversary to their adversaries, as the law plainly shows. Then arising from prayer, they took up their weapons and advanced a considerable distance from the city. When they came near the enemy, they were by themselves. But as dawn was breaking, the armies attacked one another. The one had the guarantee of prosperity and victory with their virtue and the Lord as their place of refuge, but the other depended on rage as their leader in the fight. When the battle was strongly contested, there appeared to the enemy from heaven 5 majestic men on horses with golden bridles, and they were leading the Jews. They took Maccabeus between them and shielded him with their own armor. They kept him from being wounded and cast arrows and thunderbolts on the enemy. Wherefore, confused with blindness and full of disorder, they were cut to pieces. 20,500 were slaughtered, along with 600 cavalry. Timothy himself fled to a stronghold called Gazara, especially well garrisoned, where Carus was commander. Maccabees and his men eagerly besieged the stronghold for 4 days, but the men within it trusted in the security of the place, so they kept blaspheming beyond measure and uttering disgusting words. Now when the 5th day dawned, 20 young men in the army of Maccabees burned with anger because of the blasphemies. So they bravely attacked the wall with savage fury, struck down everyone they encountered. Keep in mind, now they've got a siege. Got a siege around this tower. Okay? The people are pretty confident inside the tower. So they're trash talking, cussing, saying all manner of stuff over the walls down at the Jews. Okay, the siege has gone on for 4 days. Okay, now 20 of the Jewish troops decide they've had enough. They decide to attack the wall. Okay. So they bravely attacked the wall and with savage fury struck down everyone they encountered. Verse 36, others likewise went up during the distraction against those inside and burned down the towers. They kindled fires and burned the blasphemers alive. Others broke through the gates, led in the rest of the force, and took control of the city. They killed Timothy, who was hiding in a well, and his brother Carus and Apolophanes. When they had done this, they blessed the Lord with hymns and praises, thanking him who shows great kindness to Israel and gives him victory. I think this might be a good place to stop. Stop for tonight. Next time we'll finish up 2nd Maccabees, the last 5 chapters. So yeah, try not to focus too much. That's well, as gory and horrible as it is, as much as I wouldn't want to see it in a film, right? It is important that we remember. I mean, there's a lot of, from reading Vespers, Troparia and stuff about the martyrs. You know, they go into all, people having all their teeth and nails pulled out, and I mean all this horrible stuff. But it's important that we remember, not just in a theoretical sense, oh yes, these martyrs, our forebears, were willing to give their life for Jesus. And we remember what they went through. This wasn't just somebody putting a gun to their head and saying, deny Jesus, and they said no, and boom, it's over. I mean, this was horrific torture that would take days. This was being fed alive to animals. This was, also that they would just deny Jesus or take a little handful of incense and throw it into a censer in front of a statue of a god. They were willing to suffer all that. And that's why it's important that we remember the martyrs as heroes, and to kind of chide ourselves, because like I said, they would rather die than sin. I'd rather sin than have a tummy ache. I'd rather sin than be inconvenienced. I mean, how many times have I in my life lied just to avoid an awkward conversation? Let alone having all my teeth pulled out. So, we need to remember that. We need to remember that, and we need to be honest with ourselves. We need to move more in that direction. We need to move more in that direction of this is Christ. Obviously, we remember also his crucifixion is not a pleasant. All the things that happened to him, the beating, the torments, the crucifixion, the mockery, and everything he went through. Okay? He was willing to go through that for us. He was willing to go through that for our sake, to be faithful to us. Right? What are we willing to? We're asked, we are so blessed right now, at least in the United States of America. You don't have to go back that far. You go back 30 years to the Soviet Union. And there were Orthodox Christians just like us who had to make these same kind of decisions. Right? Do you want to be tortured and killed? Or do you want to deny Christ? You know, we have to suffer so little to be Christians here. And most of the time we're not even willing to suffer that. You know, we're embarrassed to make the sign of the cross in public. We're embarrassed to tell people we're Christians, you know, because they might think ill of us or judge us or something. You know? And that's so small compared to what so many of our fellow Christians have had to face. So we need to be thankful that we haven't been put in that situation. But we also need to move more toward, you know what, I love God enough that I'm willing to suffer a little social rejection. I'm willing to suffer having an awkward conversation rather than lie. I'm willing to fast a little bit. You know, I'm willing to, you know, nobody's going to torture me to death if I refuse to eat pork. But I could just not eat pork for 40 days. I could probably do that. You know, start moving ourselves in that direction. So reminding ourselves that as horrible as it is, I think it's important. I think even that level of detail is important. You know, at least for me. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Okay. Well, next week we'll finish up 2 Maccabees. Less gory, I promise. So thanks, everybody.
Good night.